As we've done before, read the gravestone with me. Beek, the last Indian, Ottawa, of the Maumee Valley, 1815 to 1850. We're in Grand Rapids, Ohio again. We're just outside of a small family cemetery owned by the Howard family. And there's several generations of Howards buried in that very small cemetery. I'm here today because of Tina Beek's grave, and we're going to talk about Tina Beek again later. You saw the date on there. It's 1850, 150 years ago right now, that the last Ottawa Indian living in the Maumee Valley is gone. Today we're going to look back at the 250 years that led to the events that leave Northwest Ohio with no Native Americans left by 1850. And we're going to talk about the different relations that different European powers had with the different Native American nations. And to get to this, I want to talk a little bit about relationships. All of us have been in relationships. Some of those are romantic relationships, but lots of them are the relationships that people have with friends, with family, or even with people that we don't know. At different points in life, we act very differently based on who we are around, who we're dealing with, and our relationship to them. If someone has power over us and we have no power over them in return, a lot of times we defer. A lot of times we don't push an issue. A lot of times we're not going to seek conflict because we know we're going to come out poorly in that conflict. Other times, if we need someone to do something for us, we generally have a couple of options. We can use power boldly and say, you go do this for me. So my relationship as teacher to student with you guys, I can approach you guys in a power dynamic way. And I can say, I'm the teacher, I'm 45 years old, go do your work. And you may or may not do your work, but you're definitely going to resent me later. I can also approach it as, all right, I have a goal. My goal is for you to walk out of my class knowing things you didn't know when you walked in, to be a little better students and a little better people. And I can approach it as, okay, if this is my goal, how do I manage this relationship to get these folks, you, to do the things I want to do? And I can try and build a fruitful relationship, a relationship based on trust, and a relationship in which you kind of do these things and we have a good relationship from here on out. Sometimes, however, we do treat somebody really badly in a relationship. And let's face it, we've probably had this happen in family relationships as well, where we've had a parent or a sibling, someday a child that we didn't treat the way we should have, and animosity came up between us. And we treat that person badly, they blow up at us, and then we have an option. We either break that relationship or we try to find a way to make that relationship better. Now, all these things I've talked about are the way relationships work in our personal lives. It's obviously far more complicated when we're talking about this nation having a relationship with this nation, but it is still relationship based. So I want you to kind of think about personal relationships you've had today as we talk about the relationships between the European powers in the 1600s and the Native American nations, and how some nations were more successful at managing relationships than others were, and how we probably are more successful managing relationships with some people than others. Thanks a lot, and I hope you enjoy this. I hope you guys kind of get what I was getting at there. It's not a perfect line that you can draw between relationships that we have with other people and the kind of relationships that Native Americans had with the different groups of Europeans. But the fact is, relationships exist in degrees, and relationships depend a lot on what we put into them and how we decide to manage those relationships. So we're going to talk very briefly today about the interactions and the action in those interactions in relations between Native Americans and Europeans. So from the beginning, there was misunderstanding. And if you think about almost any relationship you've ever been in your life, there are always going to be misunderstandings, right? There are going to be miscommunications. But think about how these misunderstandings and miscommunications were going to be far more consequential than those that we might have with somebody we meet. Most of the folks coming over to these colonies were from a Judeo-Christian tradition. Many are Catholic, many are Protestant, some are Jewish. Okay? It's a monotheistic tradition. They believe in one God. They basically have a common set of holy books, even if they disagree on how those faiths are played out. The native religions were many times more rooted in nature. And that's a pretty big difference when we're talking about something that people hold as important as faith. Native languages were often structured different from European languages. Remember, the languages we're talking about coming over here are English, Dutch, French, Spanish. Well, you guys already know French and Spanish are Romance languages, so they are structurally very similar, right? So in Spanish, bienvenido, and in French, oh my Lord, where's my French? I don't even speak Spanish. How is it that I came up with the Spanish first and I can't come up with the French, which I know a little bit of? This is highly embarrassing. But there's other similar words between the two languages, like in Spanish, verde, in French, vert. So French and Spanish structurally similar. English and Dutch both kind of descend in part from Germanic languages. So there were things in English and Dutch that were structurally similar. The English and French had coexisted, not always peacefully, for 1,000 years at that point. So many English knew some French, many French knew some English, especially the kind of people who were going to be doing this sort of exploring. Even if they had linguistic differences, they had a general faith in common and general language structures in common. They come to the New World, and there is very little commonality between the structure of a native language and the structure of the European languages, especially the fact that many of the languages spoke in North America were spoken-only languages. They were verbal-only languages and didn't necessarily have a written script. So that's a big difference. Societal roles and expectations. Almost all of these European nations came from patrimonial cultures where power came down through the male side of the family and males ran everything. Where some of the native structures of society were matrilineal. And the power came through the mother's side, and women had a far more important role than they did in European societies. That was a big difference. People's roles in society. All the Europeans had a king, a hierarchy, peasants. Natives didn't really have that. Very few of the native nations were structured in that pyramidical, hierarchical way. Then, in addition to just misunderstanding, you had animosity, like legitimate beef, legitimate anger between people. So, first of all, let's talk about that animosity, and let's think about the most important way it goes. The Europeans literally came to take their stuff, right? They have come over here. We're going to take land that you live on. We think we're paying you for it, but in many of the native systems, they didn't think a person could own land, right? They had this, their religion is rooted in nature. The land is nature. I can't own God. And if the land is part of God, I can't own God. And these guys are saying, oh, we're going to buy this off you. And they're kind of like, whatever, okay. But they're still coming onto your hunting lands, coming onto your fishing lands, and saying you can't be there anymore. The Europeans are literally coming and taking things that belong to them. The Europeans, sometimes in the best case scenario, do believe that they're compensating them fairly, but the natives don't always perceive it that way, quite justifiably. Some of this animosity is going to be based on just simple misunderstanding. Other is people who are literally like, I'm coming to take everything that's yours. A lot of the animosity begins with small-scale conflicts. A fight here, a fight there, a couple people die. It's almost more like something that we would see as a beef between people or families in a city or a town. Sometimes these small-scale conflicts grew bigger. Now, how did they grow bigger? Why did they grow bigger? Because a lot of the European countries thought that they were playing three-dimensional chess. They thought, oh, I'm playing this global game of chess. You remember the mercantilism that we talked about? If I have this land, you don't. If I have these workers, you don't. A lot of the European nations are using the native nations as pawns in their chess game. So they're trying to play native nations against each other. They're trying to play native nations against the European nations. So, two examples, an English nation might give weapons and support to one native nation to attack a French outpost and then be like, oh, no, we didn't do that. What are you talking about? That's crazy. We didn't do that. And then the French would do the same thing, right? They'd give weapons. They'd give supplies to another group saying, oh, it is no big deal if you attack the English settlement down there, right? No? And then another example would be, so a French colonial government or French colonial administration sees a certain native nation as a threat, or they see another native nation as, we want to be friends with these guys because they have lots of reach to the inland areas. So they would give that nation weapons to go to war with another native nation to gain the favor of that first nation. They will like us more if we give them weapons. This is all changing the nature of conflict on the North American continent. They're bringing in weapons that had never been used, creating alliances that had never existed. How does this play out? Well, there's two big things we're going to talk about briefly. First is King Philip's War, also called Metacomet's War, from 1675 to 1678. This is happening up in New England, and it's happening at a period from like 1640, 1650 on to the 1670s, when the number of English migrants into this area is steadily increasing. The Wampanoag Nation lives up there, and the Wampanoags are up in like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, that sector of New England. The leader of their nation is this guy named Metacomet, who the English called King Philip. And Metacomet starts kind of realizing this situation with these English colonists is bad and getting worse. And if we want to maintain our way of life, at some point we need to eject them from this continent. And so Metacomet builds what I call a multinational alliance. He gets people from many different native nations to team together and fight against these colonist settlers and their native allies, because the colonists did have allies. They did have Native American nations that sided with them. But Metacomet has a really large multinational alliance, multinational force that he's going to lead. As this is happening, the colonists find that they're on their own. The British government is not sending over the redcoats to help them out. The colonists are going to fight this war over 3 years on their own. Over the course of this 2.5, 3-year conflict, 10% of all military age males die. By percentage, if you are looking at military age males in the United States today, population of the United States today is about 330 million. Split that in half, it's about 165 million men. Drop that in half, it's like 85 million men of military age, roughly. This is a rough guesstimate. If 10% of all military age men today were to die, that would be like 8.5 million casualties. Our deadliest war was the Civil War, where there were 600,000 casualties, and in King Philip's War, there were only about 1,000 casualties, but that was out of 10,000 guys of military age. It was a huge dent in the population of the American colonists, of these English colonists in the Americas. And the losses were even worse for King Philip's multinational alliance. King Philip's War is the last major attempt in the northern parts of America. It's the last major attempt of native nations to break the English colonists' desire to stay, to get them to go back where they came from. And it also has another effect that's going to be critically important over the next 200 years. A lot of these colonists become fiercely anti-native. And we're going to see that the English approach to relations with Native Americans is going to be worse than any of the other European nations. Now, running in a close second are the Spanish. And this is the last thing we're going to talk about in this short discussion today. The Pueblo Revolt happens just a couple of years after King Philip's War, but it happens all the way over in New Mexico, like near Santa Fe, New Mexico today, which back then was just part of Spanish America. The Spanish had forbidden the Pueblo people and the other associated peoples in what is today New Mexico from their kind of ancestral religious practices. They were converting all of them to Catholicism. And if there's one way to get people mad at you, it's to mess with their religion. It's to tell them you can't practice your religion anymore. That isn't just an assault on my land or my property or my family. It's an assault on who I am. And those are wounds that dig deep. So along comes a guy named Pope.
looks like Pope. It's Pope. And Pope is kind of a like super, like, what am I? He's a really motivating guy, like a really charismatic guy. And Pope kind of gathers the Pueblo people and says, we don't have to deal with this. We can do something about it. There are only a few hundred of the Spanish, and there are thousands of us. And they have this elaborate plan, like it's a countdown on a knotted string to the day that, like, their D-Day for the battle to begin. And this widely coordinated rebellion begins against the Spanish throughout a vast territory. Hundreds of people are killed just at the very beginning of this. Hundreds of Spanish settlers are killed at the outset. The war is going to rage on for quite some time. And over that time, the Spanish are going to kind of come to realize we have to make accommodations. We can't just eliminate the Indians because we need them. So they're going to accommodate native cultures in what is today America's Southwest. And this is a very different approach than we saw in King Philip's War, where they're not going to make any accommodations in New England for Native American culture. It's going to be eradication. This is a very big difference. Why do we care about this? Bottom line, interactions in North America between British, France, Spain, and the multiple different Native American nations are going to set patterns in diplomacy. Diplomacy is talking through our problems, nation to nation. Military action, whether I decide to go to war with you or not. And what's this going to be based on? Sometimes it's based on relative strength. The Spanish did not have a lot of strength down in the Southwest. They had to come to an agreement. They had to accommodate. Whereas the English felt they had enough strength in the 1670s to go to war and fight kind of a war of annihilation. It also came down to how bad I need you. The Spanish and the French needed the Native Americans because the Native Americans provided labor for both of them. For the Spanish, it was direct labor in building, in farming, etc. For the French, it was the labor of going out, killing the animals, trapping the animals, and bringing the pelts back to them. For the English, as we well know, up in New England, it's small family farms where the family is the labor. In the South, by the time we get to the 1670s, it's already enslaved African labor. They don't need the Native Americans down there either. And because the English did not rely on a relationship, and this is where we bring it back to the beginning, the English didn't need this relationship or didn't perceive that they needed this relationship. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the people who see no mutual benefit are going to treat those other people the worst. And this is, I think, the tragedy, one of the great tragedies in American history, and it's the beginning of an absolute atrocity of Native American extermination between the 1670s and the 1880s, and discrimination against Native Americans that frankly continues to this day as we talk. Thanks for sticking with me, guys. As always, remember,
even with all of this, you're doing great.